I'm very pleased to welcome our first speaker of the year. She is Mairi McLaughlin, and she's professor in the Department of French and an affiliated member of Italian Studies and Linguistics at UC Berkeley. She specializes in French and Romance linguistics, as well as translation studies. She's published extensively on language contact in French and Romance, on the language of the media, and on journalistic and literary translation. She's particularly interested in the language of the media, and specifically on the role that it plays in language variation and change, the use that is made of reported speech, and the linguistic and textual effects of news translation. Her first book was published in 2011, and it was Syntactic Borrowing in Contemporary French, a linguistic analysis of news translation. The second book, I'm going to make a complete mangly mess of this, but anyway, La Presse Française Historique, Histoire d'un genre et Histoire de la langue, has just been published, I gather, by Garnier this year. That's great. Mairi is currently working on digital and critical editions of the first periodical devoted to the French language itself. And this is an 18th century journal, and she is currently co-editing the Oxford Handbook of the French Language with Wendy Bennett, who is here this afternoon too. So welcome to you, Wendy. And without further ado, Mairi, I think I will hand over to you. And if you'd like, again, to share your slides and proceed, that would be great. Your talk, I think, is called The Early French Press. So I think this is hot off the press, really. Examining a new text type in historical linguistics, and she did that for us. Thank you so much. I'll let you go.
All right. Thank you very much, Susan, and you did brilliantly with the title of the book, so no worries there. I want to start just by saying thank you for inviting me to give this lecture today. I remember joining the Philological Society as a graduate student at Cambridge, so it's very nice to now come back, even virtually, and present to the Society today. Let's see. I've gone too far. Sorry, here we go. Okay, so I want to get the marketing out of the way first. So indeed, Susan, as you said, the work the data that I'm going to be presenting today comes from my most recent book. This is a book on the origins and evolution of journalistic language in French. It was published earlier this year by Garnier. I'm going to be presenting some data from the book in order to think through the larger question for my talk today, which is the question about genre in historical linguistic research. For some reason, there we go. For some reason, this is not working quite properly. Okay, so the outline of my talk is fairly simple. I'm going to start with an overview of the research project. I'm then going to present the results from two case studies, one on the passive and one on Clitic Climbing. And I'm going to conclude with a slightly longer than normal discussion where I'm going to think through this problem of genre and historical linguistic research. So let's get started then with the project itself, the Historical French Press. So the aims of this project are to provide the first linguistic study of the language of historical French newspapers and periodicals. It covers the period from the founding of the first periodical or first successful long-term periodical in 1631 to the French Revolution of 1789. So it's basically 17th, 18th century. The project has two foci. I'm interested on the one hand in the history of the genre, and on the other hand in the history of the French language. So this work is situated at the intersection of a range of fields, but most directly it comes out of work being done on the history of French. Historians of the language have long recognized the fact that the French press probably played a role in the evolution of the language. People like Bruno, Capu, Séguin, Huchon more recently have linked the development of the French press to the spread of French within France and the elimination of the dialects, to the spread of French outside France in the 18th century, where it becomes a kind of international language used by members of the social elite. The scientific press has been linked more specifically to the replacement of Latin as the language of science. And in general, over a range of centuries, the press has been associated with various parts of the process of standardization. Despite these general claims about the role of the press in the history of the language, there's been rather little scholarly work done on the question. The most significant and kind of closest work to this project comes from Wendy Ayres-Bennett in her History of the French Language Through Text, where she analyzes in detail an extract from one of the historical periodicals that we'll be looking at today. Other than that, sometimes you find individual extracts or examples quoted from historical newspapers and periodicals. So Bourova and Dondal, for example, in their work on a specific use of the conditional in French across time, cite a couple of examples from the Gazette de France. There's been a little bit more work on a text type which I would consider related to the periodical press, but not actually a periodical publication. And those are the 17th century mazarinades. These are political pamphlets that were written and circulated in the middle of the 17th century. And both Wendy Ayres-Bennett and Anthony Lodge looked at, in some detail at the mazarinade. But as I think we'll see, they don't really share many of the linguistic features of the kinds of text that I'm looking at today. So this lack of scholarship, or relative lack of scholarship on the language of the historical French press is a direct reflection of the fact that until recently, historical linguistic research on French was dominated by literary texts. And I'm not the only person to have noticed this, to be reacting against this. So here under one on the slide, you have a quote from Ayres-Bennett et al. This is an edited volume that was also a conference. And one of the aims of the conference and the volume is to explore what the sources are that remain underused in diachronic studies and to what extent they let us expand our understanding of the history of French. So I've cited just a few examples of the more prominent recent studies that contribute to the diversification of text types in work on the history of French. So there's this volume by Ayres-Bennett et al. Where you have things like sermons, music, diplomatic texts. Ayres-Bennett herself has done some of this in her History of the French Language Through Text and her book on sociolinguistic variation in 17th century French. Ballon and Larrivée have looked at legal texts in order to try to create a new dating of the loss of the null subject parameter in Old French. Anthony Lodge, for similar reasons to Ayres-Bennett, has involved a wider range of text type in his sociolinguistic history of Parisian French. And France Martineau has done something similar for French in North America. For some reason, this is, whenever I press, it doesn't, yeah, here we go. Okay, we'll have to bear with me with the technological issue here. This the kind of relative absence of scholarship on historical news writing in French is quite at odds with what we see in other fields. So most obviously, if you look at the history of English, you'll see that there is a really large kind of flourishing body of research on historical news discourse. Rather than citing the names of important works or people, I just have a reference here to a chapter by Carol Percy from the Handbook of Historical Sociolinguistics, which covers the language of newspapers and advertising. So not only is there an existing body of scholarship on the historical English press, there are also, unlike for French, existing structured electronic corpora, including the Florence Early English Newspaper Corpus, the Zurich English Newspaper Corpus, and the Rostock Corpus of English Newspapers. There's nothing of the sort for French. There's also a regular conference now on historical news discourse in English called KINED or CHINED conference, which they definitely accept people working on other languages, but until recently it was mostly people working on English. There's also an obvious contrast if you look at what's happening in contemporary French linguistics, where there's a very large amount of work involving the language of the media, either used as a source of linguistic data that's easily accessible or because it is inherently interesting itself. And rather than giving you the names here, this would be a sort of endless list right now of names of people doing this kind of work. I've just got a general quotation from Alan Bell, who explains the reasons for this interest in the language of the media in general. So he explains that the practical and principled reasons for this interest include the accessibility of language data from the media, the significance of the media as language producing institutions, linguistic interest in the ways that media use language, and the importance of media institutions and their discourses in shaping culture, politics, and social life. Although there hasn't been very much work done by linguists on the history of the French press, there has been a huge amount of work done by historians, and this project really relies on that body of work. There are big general projects on the history of the French press by people like Trenard, Fayel, and Sgard. And there are also projects on individual publications, some of the publications that I'm working on here, like the Gazette de France, the Journal des Savants, or the Mercure Galant. So at the start of this project, I read through that body of scholarship, and it really highlighted, on the one hand, the promise of this work on historical periodicals and newspapers, but also the immense challenges that one was going to face. And this kind of twin promise and challenge is highlighted in the quotation under one here. This is from Stefan Hafmeyer, who has an exceptionally good study of the Gazette d'Amsterdam the Gazette de France in the middle of the 17th century. He's interested in the circulation of information in the mid-17th century. So he highlights the Gazette de France as a top tier source for historical research. And he attributes this to two reasons. First is its continuity, and second is its homogeneity. And the ears of historical linguists should prick up here, because the fact that the text type remains the same and is continuous means that we might be able to use these texts to access linguistic change. If the text type stays stable, then the changes that we're seeing may reflect changes taking place in the language. The second half of his quotation highlights the difficulties, because he here tells us that it's really difficult to work out how to handle the Gazette de France, even just one newspaper, because of the immense amount of data that it represents. So just to look at some numbers from Hafmeyer, over the course of just 17 years, the Gazette de France published 20,372 dispatches. They were printed across 22,202 pages, and they came from a whopping 779 different places in Europe. So having read through this scholarship, I formulated a set of research questions which relate either to the journalistic genre or to the history of French. So for the journalistic genre, I wanted to know first what the origins of the language of the press were. How did people know how to write journalistic texts in 1631? Second, I wanted to know how journalistic writing evolved in the first 2 centuries of its existence. Third, I wanted to explore the relationship between the language of the historical press and the language of the contemporary press. And this is important if we want to do historical linguistic research. Are we able, in fact, to compare historical and contemporary news texts and draw any conclusions about the evolution of the language rather than just the evolution of the genre? As regards to the history of French, the questions were as follows. I wanted to know if we incorporate data from this new text type into the work on the history of French, what can we find out about language variation and change? I wanted to know whether journalistic French is more innovative than literary French in this period. That's something that might be said frequently about journalistic writing today. So is that also true in the past? And finally, I wanted to test whether it is true that the French press played a role in the evolution of French in the 17th and 18th centuries. So before we go any further, it's useful to give you a very schematic overview of the history of the French press in this period. So until 1631, there was indeed news that circulated, and printed news. It just wasn't periodical. So news was printed and circulated in response to events that took place. So what changes in 1631 is that the first successful French language periodical, the Gazette de France, is founded. There are some periodical publications in French before that, but they don't really get off the ground. In 1665, the next periodical is founded, the Journal des Savants. This is where the Gazette published short news dispatches that are fairly similar to the kinds of news dispatches published by news agencies today. The Journal des Savants, on the other hand, is the first scientific publication. It's a sister publication of the Royal Transactions of the Philosophical Society, not the Philological Society. In 1672, the next big periodical is founded, the Mercure Galant, and this is a much lighter review. It covers some of the same topics as the Gazette de France and the Journal des Savants, but in a much lighter, more engaging tone. And in that same decade, there develops outside France an important set of newspapers and periodicals published in French. This is a direct consequence of Huguenot refugees fleeing religious persecution in France, and it obviously contributes to the spread. This is what contributes to the spread of French as an international language outside French in the 18th century. things remained fairly linear until the 1740s, when there are important postal reforms in France. That means that it gets cheaper to distribute newspapers. You can therefore publish more of them and publish them more frequently. And so as a result of that, in the 1750s and 1760s, you see the first specialist publications like the Journal des Dames, the Journal for Women, or the Journal de Médecine, a medical periodical. It's not until 1772 that the first daily newspaper is founded, the Journal de Paris, and the period that I'm looking at ends in 1789 with the Revolution, because everything changes. So in this slide, you have some information about the methodology used in this study. So you won't be surprised to hear that I used a corpus. Because there were no existing corpora, unlike for English, this is a corpus that I designed and compiled myself. So it's structured along two axes. Horizontally, you can see diachronic evolution, and vertically, you've got a range of different newspapers. Most of them are newspapers I've already mentioned. So if we look first at the newspapers, you've got, first of all, the Gazette de France, the first periodical, the Journal des Savants, the Mercure Galant. I then included the Gazette d'Amsterdam. This is like the Gazette, this is exactly the same genre, but it's published outside France. So that lets me compare the press from France and from elsewhere. And finally, the Journal de Paris, the first daily newspaper. So these are all core generalist publications identified by historians as important in the period. They all reached a relatively wide readership, and they all crucially still existed at the end of the period. So that's why they were chosen. So the quotation from Hafmeyer that highlights the volume of data reflected by the press suggests then that there's no way I could have worked on every edition of even one of these newspapers. So I constructed a sample, and I used two notions to do that. The first was the notion of the generation, which means that I sampled the newspapers every 25 years. And then I used a notion from media studies research of the constructed week, where you construct 1 week over the course of 7 weeks. So rather than selecting a newspaper on a Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday of 1 week, you do one Monday 1 week, Tuesday the next week, Wednesday the third week. So you capture a kind of larger snapshot that way. So I adapted that because there are no daily papers till the end of the period. I adapted that and have a kind of constructed year. So for each of the months that you see on the screen, then I included every edition of the newspaper or periodical. So for January 1632 for the Gazette de France, and then March 1657, May 1682, and so on. Because these newspapers hadn't been digitized, I transcribed, or had help transcribing a large portion of the corpus. So I transcribed every edition of each newspaper when it first appears in the corpus. I also transcribed all of the editions from 1782 to have a complete synchronic snapshot. And then I transcribed every edition in the corpus of the Journal des Savants and the Gazette d'Amsterdam to do more kind of detailed work on both of those publications. So overall, the corpus is around 500,000 words, of which 400,000 are transcribed. So this is very much, I would say, a kind of medium-sized corpus. And it permits me to do the kind of quantitative and qualitative analysis that I think is necessary at this stage in the field. The way that the book is structured is around a kind of combination of both general coverage, really unveiling the sort of obvious, kind of general obvious features of the language of the historical press, but also some detailed case studies, and that's what I'll be presenting today. So just before moving on, I wanted to share a couple of images so you know what I'm looking at. So this is the first page of the Gazette de France from the 2nd of January, 1632. You'll see that, like a contemporary newspaper, it has a masthead. You then have a series of dispatches printed in paragraphs, and what you have alongside the dispatches in the margins are just the information about where the dispatch comes from and the date that it was produced. So that first one is from Constantinople on the 23rd of October, 1631. So it took over 2 months to get to Paris at that time. And then this is the same newspaper at the end of the period. You can see the masthead is a bit richer. Columns have been introduced to save space, save money. And the information about the dispatches is still present, but it's integrated into the text, no longer appearing in the margins. Okay, so the first case study that I'm going to present concerns the passive. So this is a reminder for most people, I imagine. So in French, as in other languages, there's recognized to be a line of constructions that are more or less passive-like. Today, I'm going to be looking at two of the most widely recognized passive-like constructions, the prototypical passive and the impersonal passive. So as in English, the prototypical passive in French is formed with the verb to be with a past participle, and the patient of the action becomes the subject. So in this first example, les prisonniers ont été menés, or in English, the prisoners were taken. The impersonal passive is similar. You have the verb to be and a past participle, but instead of having the patient as the subject is the impersonal pronoun il. So there's a large body of scholarship on the passive in French, and this already kind of sets the stage for an interesting case study. So to begin with, the passive, as in English, is widely recognized as a characteristic feature of journalistic style. Reasons for this include the fact that it allows the journalist to create an objective or neutral tone, which increases credibility. It also practically allows the journalist to write in a more concise way, and journalists are always writing under the pressures of both space and time. Interestingly, however, despite this, the passive tends to be proscribed both in general style guides and in style guides written for journalists specifically. This started first in English, and it seems to be an example of a borrowing of a linguistic attitude. It starts in style guides for English and then gets added to style guides for French. It's not just in style guides that people are suspicious of the passive. In linguistics, in the field of critical discourse analysis, scholars express concern about the use of the passive in administrative language, in journalistic writing, because in their view, it can be used to hide the body or person responsible for an action. I think more formally minded linguists might not share that same view. They might look more to, for example, the easy recoverability of an agent to explain why it might be absent. The passive also has a rather special status in French because it's linked to contact with English. So in my book from 2011, I explored the translation of news from English into French to see whether, as hypothesized in the previous literature, translating news leads to syntactic borrowing, and one of the constructions thought to be involved is the passive. So the idea would be that as journalists translate news from English, where the passive is naturally more frequent than it is in French, they would borrow this structure into French. So the aims of this study are to examine the frequency and the form of the prototypical and impersonal passives in the Gazette de France and in the Gazette d'Amsterdam. I'm just looking at the months when these two gazettes first appear in the corpus, so 1632 and 1707. The purpose of this study is to use the passive to get a better understanding of the relationship between historical and contemporary news writing. And I also wanted to build upon observations already made by Wendy Ayres-Bennett in her history of the French language through texts, because she noticed in the extract of the Mercure Galon that she looked at that passive and impersonal constructions abound just as they do today. And implicitly then this raises the question about this contact hypothesis. If there was already present in the past, then how can we possibly believe that the passive is used because of English influence today? So I extracted all of the tokens of the passive from these two periodicals, and you have the results here on screen. So you have the newspaper down the sides, the Gazette de France and the Gazette d'Amsterdam, and then the data for the prototypical passive followed by the impersonal passive. So in general, I think we can say that we can confirm Ayres-Bennett's general observation that the passive and impersonal constructions do indeed abound in news writing in the past. So overall, we have 428 tokens of both combined. So this is definitely not a rare form. You can see from the data on the frequency of these two constructions per 1,000 words that the prototypical passive is far more frequent than the impersonal passive, so 6.3 per 1,000 words for the prototypical passive and 0.42 for the impersonal passive. This is not at all surprising. It's exactly what we would expect. The impersonal passive has always been a much more marginal construction. So in order to use this case study to understand the relationship between historical and contemporary news writing, I compared this data with data from the corpus of translated news dispatches that I worked on for my book published in 2011. So this is a corpus of 1,000 or so news dispatches translated from English into French. which I had compiled for that project. So the table shows you then the frequency or the relative frequency of both the prototypical and impersonal passives, and first the historical and then the contemporary corpus. So if we look first at the results for the impersonal passive, we see that it appears its average frequency is 0.42 per 1,000 words in the historical corpus and 0.1 in the contemporary corpus. So it's relatively rare in both corpora. This isn't surprising. It also becomes more rare over time. This is also not surprising because linguists have already pointed to the fact that this construction is lost over time in French. What is surprising, on the other hand, is what we see for the prototypical passive. So you'll see that it's used on average 6.3 times per 1,000 words in the historical corpus and 6.46 times per 1,000 words in the contemporary corpus. This frequency is strikingly similar, given the fact that we're working on texts produced in very different conditions, 300 or so years apart. So this result really highlights the stability of certain aspects of news writing over time. And in particular, I think it highlights the similarity between the dispatches published by the Gazette in the 17th and 18th century and the news dispatches published today. And this is useful for historical linguists because it means we can perhaps do more comparative work on these text types. This data also raises a couple of questions for me. The first is it makes me wonder what the value of this sort of metalinguistic discourse against the passive might be. So in the 17th and 18th century, there was no metalinguistic discourse against the use of the passive. That flourishes in the 20th century, but in this time, the frequency of the passive doesn't change. So this makes me wonder whether the communicative functions of the passive in news writing are just so clear that it is still maintained despite the metalinguistic discourse. And similarly, for the hypothesis that English influence leads to a higher use of the passive today, it looks pretty clear from the data here that in the 17th and 18th century, when there was no such influence from English, or where we think there was no such influence from English, the passive is used at the same rate as it is today. So how could it possibly be the effect of contact? This I soon discovered with a less quantitative and more qualitative approach. This question mark probably needs to disappear. I think actually this work has done the opposite. It's actually confirmed the contact hypothesis. So what you have on the screen here is a dispatch that comes from London. You don't need the translation. The important thing here is just is what I've done in bold. So this is a dispatch that's 132 words long, and you'll see in bold, these are all the passive constructions. So the passive is appearing extremely frequently in news translated from London. So on the basis of dispatches like this, I decided to distinguish in the frequency counts between news that is news that comes from London and that was therefore translated from English, and news that comes from elsewhere. And you can see the data here in this table for first the Gazette de France and then the Gazette d'Amsterdam. So this table shows really clearly that the passive is more frequent in news that comes from London. It increases by more than 100% in the Gazette de France from 5.37 to 12.97 per 1,000 words. And it increases around 50% in the Gazette d'Amsterdam from 6.58 to 9.48. This importantly is very similar to the effect that we see in contemporary news translation. And in fact, from translation studies, from the perspective of translation studies, this is not at all surprising. In the 1990s, Mona Baker developed the notion of the translation universal based on linguistic universals. These are basically the large general trends that distinguish translated language from originally produced language. And one of those universals is precisely this kind of interference. So instead of undermining the contact hypothesis as I originally thought, I think this data actually confirms the contact hypothesis, but instead we should probably see as interference from source languages as a kind of constant feature of international news. And that's obviously a wider hypothesis to test in a future study. The final part of the case study on the passive that I want to share with you concerns the agentive phrase. So as in English, the book was read by Mary. In French, le livre a été lu par Marie. You can express the agent by means of a prepositional phrase. In English, we use by. In French, two prepositions are available, de and par. And as the quote in one shows, statistics based on literary texts, we assume, have shown that the agent was normally introduced by the preposition de in classical French. That's the 17th century. So in that period, par had a more marked value. So I wanted to check whether the same thing was true of the journalistic texts. And you have the data here in the table. So if you look, first of all, just at the data for de, you can see that there is the decline we would expect over time because de gradually loses out to par in the history of French. So it's 47% of tokens in 1632, 27 in 1707, and just 2% of tokens in my contemporary corpus. Quite surprisingly, however, there is no evidence that de was dominant in the early 17th century, as we would expect, given what we know about the history of this change from literary texts. So this calls into question the dating of the change in the previous literature, and it also makes us think more broadly about genre in historical linguistic research. What does it mean that most of what we knew until recently about the history of French came from literary texts? Okay, so the next case study that I'm going to present concerns Clitic climbing. So the loss of Clitic climbing in French is a relatively well-studied change. This starts with Gallet's monumental study from 1971, where she surveyed the use of Clitic climbing across an incredible number of texts and genres. More recent scholarship has been carried out also on this change by Ayres Bennett and Ayres Bennett with Caron, and also Iglesias. So this is something you probably already all know, but Clitic climbing happens, or is said to happen, in the context where a pronoun, Clitic pronoun, is used alongside a finite verb governing an infinitive. And when the Clitic pronoun appears before the finite verb, climbing is said to take place. When it appears later, there is no climbing. So I've illustrated this with an example from French. So je le veux faire, which becomes je veux le faire in the history of the language. So this means I want to do it. So in the first example, je le veux faire, there is Clitic climbing. It's I, it, want to do. And in the second example, there's no climbing. It's I want to, it, do. So because this is quite a well-studied change in the history of the language, we have quite a lot of information about the chronology of the change. And it's very clear that until the 17th century, the order with climbing was preferred in French. In the 17th century, everything changes. And by the 18th century, it's going to be the order without climbing that's preferred, as it is today. And there's so much work on the 17th century that we can actually date the change very specifically to the 1660s and 1670s across different text types. So in this study, then, I wanted to examine the frequency of the orders with and without climbing in the Gazette de France. That's the paper that appears every 25 years from the beginning to the end of the corpus, so it can be very systematic. I wanted, first of all, to see whether the change took place at the same time in journalistic texts as it did in the other genres that have been studied, more specifically if it took place in the 1660s and 1670s. And I wanted to compare the process of change, the way that the change took place across the different text types. So the previous literature has demonstrated features of the trajectory of the change. It's shown that the range of governing verbs decreases as the order with climbing is lost. And Iglesias has suggested that the change takes place first in more complex syntactic environments. So to do this work, because it was the intention was to be comparative with existing studies, I basically reapplied Gallet's methodology from 1971, and I extracted the first 50 examples of the context that could permit climbing from 1 month of editions of the Gazette de France every 25 years from 1632 to 1782. So here you have the results for the date of the change. So you can see the dates in the corpus on the left-hand side, and then in the middle columns, the frequency of the orders with and without climbing. So overall, I have 272 examples. I didn't quite get to the target 350 examples because there just aren't enough tokens of the relevant context in a month worth of editions of each of these periodicals. For example, in the final year, you only have 47, but I still think it's enough data to be able to say something. If you wanted to know what the average rate of climbing was over the course of these 2 centuries, I actually don't know why you would, but it's 59%. So this graph represents the same thing, but visually to help us see the change. The dark orange color represents the order with climbing, the older order, and the light orange represents the new order, the order without climbing. So the fact that at the start of the period, the order with climbing is dominant, and by the end of the period, it is no longer dominant, means that we're looking at the right chronological window here. And then if you look at the moment when the order with climbing falls below 50% for the first time, that's very clearly between 1657 and 1682. And this coincides exactly with the decades of 1660s and 1670s identified as the moment of change in previous studies of other genres. If you look to the end of the period, so if we use a model of linguistic change, which assumes that a change has come to completion, when the new form represents at least 95% of occurrences, then this change completes by 1757. Interestingly, this is actually slightly earlier than the completion of the change in literary texts, if we look at Galli's data. And I think the reason for that is that the order with climbing acquires a sort of stylistic value in this period. And in fact, you can still find climbing today used for very intentionally with a stylistic value of archaism. So I think this construction with climbing is retained slightly longer in literary texts because there's perhaps more value to the archaic, or more function to the archaic value of the construction for literary authors than for journalists. So then for the process of change, we're going to look at first the general trajectory, then the governing verbs, and then the complexity of change, just so you can see where we're going here. So the previous literature has described several different aspects of the trajectory of change. First of all, it's been shown to be a gradual change, and we also see that here. It does not happen overnight. Secondly, scholars have identified the existence of a significant amount of variation, both within texts and across between different authors. This is something obviously that is clearly illustrated in this corpus too, by examples such as 1 and 2. So both of these examples come from the same edition of the Gazette de France in 1707. They both involve the same governing verb, pouvoir, but one example displays climbing and one does not. So in the first case, en cas qu'ils ne puissent le défendre, if they hadn't been able to defend it, there is not climbing. And in the second case, dès qu'elles l'ont pu faire, as soon as they could do it, there is climbing. Ayres, Bennett, and Caron have also spoken to the acceleration in the rate of change in their corpus, and this is something that we see in this graph quite clearly. The drop between 1632 and 1657 is quite small, and then there's a sudden drop off. Then this is really the kind of classic S-shaped curve that we would expect for a linguistic change. And finally, Iglesias has insisted on the fact that this is a really kind of classic case of syntactic change through grammatical competition. So you have a dominant form A, a minority form B is then introduced. The minority form B then becomes dominant, and A is still used, and in the final stage, only form B is in use, and that's the final stage that we reach in 1757. So the trajectory of the change looks the same. The process of change, the second part of the process of change that I want to look at is the loss of the variety in governing verbs with this construction. So as the order with climbing falls out, it is found with a more and more restricted range of verbs, and we see this in this corpus too. So if you have 5, 6, 7 verbs in the early part of the corpus, by the end you only have 1 or 2 verbs. Finally, Iglesias has suggested that the syntactic environment, or the complexity of the syntactic environment, affects the loss of the order with climbing. So he suggests, I think this might be true more widely in linguistic change, right, that the change starts to take place first in more complex contexts. And for him, the complex contexts are things like the presence of a preposition, what he calls verbal macro complexes. So that's where you have not 2, but 3 verbs. So a finite verb and 2 infinitives. Cases where you have 2 coordinated infinitives, or cases where material, like some kind of adverbial, surfaces between the finite and the infinitive verb. With the number of tokens that I have here, I don't think I could ever offer any kind of firm quantitative conclusion on this, but in general, I think it can be said that the data appear to confirm this trend. So if you look at the first part of the period, when the order with climbing is dominant, the order without climbing, the new order, appears mostly in complex contexts. So it's not being introduced at the start in simple contexts. And then conversely, if you look at the end of the period, the order with climbing, where it is maintained, it's still in those simple contexts. So that seems to confirm his general finding. Okay, so in this final section, I want to broaden the scope now and use the experience of designing, carrying out this project and the results that I've presented today, and also those published in the book, to think through more broadly, first, the use of newspapers and periodicals in historical linguistic research, and second, the question of genre in historical linguistics more generally. So the first question to think about is why? Why should we use newspapers and periodicals in historical linguistic research? So the first answer to this question takes us right back to the start of the presentation and the quotation from Hafmeier, which emphasized the immense volume of data that historical newspapers and periodicals represent. And this data is for the most part untapped. So the results that I presented today were based on just a small sample of 5 periodicals. But if you look in Jean Sgar's Dictionnaire des Journaux, the dictionary of journals from the 17th and 18th centuries, he finds 1,267 different titles. So what we've seen today really isn't the tip of the iceberg, it's sort of the tip of the iceberg. And there's a huge amount more out to do. The second advantage offered by newspapers and periodicals relates to their periodic or the periodic nature of their publication. This is invaluable for diachronic research because it lets you do the kind of sampling that I've done today. And you could also do something much more fine-grained, covering a shorter period of time and looking at many more years than I did. In addition, although we don't always know who authored each of the journalistic texts that are published, we do tend to know exactly where and when they were authored. This has been already for me really valuable because it lets us date, because when you can date specific texts so precisely, you can find out a little bit more about linguistic change. So I want to give you just one example here, which is unfortunately now all too relevant, which is the example of the word inoculation or inoculation. So the equivalent of the OED in French, the Trésor de la langue française, dates this to a book published in French in October 1723. The word existed before, but it wasn't used in its medical sense. I've managed to look at the use of this term in the Journal des Savants and found that it's actually used still in the same year in 1723, but it appears in January for the first time. So this might seem a little bit trivial, it's just a few months earlier, but I think it highlights the relative value of periodical texts compared perhaps to published books, because published books have a much longer publication timeline. And so if we want, or if we're interested in the role that the printed word might have played in language variation and change, then periodicals seem to represent potentially a more important source, or an additionally important source perhaps. The size of the readership is also another reason for incorporating newspapers and periodicals. So in this quote under 1 on the slide from Jeremy Popkin, we see this very clearly. He says that the readership of periodicals in this period in France was larger perhaps than that of any other genre of printed material except for popular almanacs and devotional work. News texts, as we know all too well from fake news today, have an ability to reach a readership that is both broader and deeper than many literary texts. So this makes it more urgent, I think, that we examine this genre and the text types that it includes. Finally, various results from my study, some of which I've presented here, some of which are in the book, suggest that certain aspects, at least of journalistic writing, are more innovative than the better studied literary texts. We saw this today with the lack of dominance of de in expressing the agent in the passive construction, and we also saw it with the earlier completion of the loss of clitic climbing in journalistic texts. I think that probably more work is needed here if we're going to be able to tell whether these results speak to the relatively innovative status of journalistic writing, or whether they actually testify to the relatively archaic status or conservative status of the types of literary texts that we tend to look at. So that other work then is going to have to involve other genres. The second question is when should we look at historical newspapers and periodicals in historical linguistic research? So most obviously we should turn to them as part of this general diversification of the text types used for historical linguistics. All I would say here is the text types that I'm working on here stay quite close to the written literary standard, not really moved as far away as, say, people working on the manuscript letters of semi-literate soldiers in the First World War. A second reason for working on newspapers and periodicals is if we're interested in historical genre studies. The quotation from Nivelainen and Remmel and Brunberg highlights the diversity of this field. So it's interested both in the linguistic makeup of texts in their generic conventions, but also in the general practices of production and consumption of texts. And I think that both of these avenues are really important if we want to understand the history of a given genre, but they're also really important for historical linguists. So I'll give you just one example here. It wasn't until I understood the extent to which news was translated in this period that I grasped the potential of historical newspapers and periodicals to contribute to borrowing at a whole range of linguistic levels. The third context in which we might want to look at newspapers and periodicals is when we're interested in the history of a given language. So I've done that here with French. With the passive, we've kind of called into question the dating of a linguistic change with the replacement of par by de. And with Clitic Climbing, we've sort of done the opposite and really confirmed the dating in the previous literature. At a higher level, the results emerging from this study have led to some general hypotheses about language variation and change. So whatever form I looked at, even if you had variation in the date at which a change took place, it seemed to be the case that changes always took place in the same way across text types. This, I think, is really important because if the same steps in linguistic change are observed across text types, it means that we must be somehow through these different text types accessing the way that the linguistic change actually took place in that abstract system, right, that is language. Working on historical periodicals and newspapers is also important if we're interested in the relationship between language and the media. This was sort of uninteresting for a while to sociolinguists. More recently, people have really recognized the important role played by the media in language variation and change. I've highlighted my book here just because I've already spoken about it, but I think James Stuart Smith's work and the work of the Glasgow Media Group more generally is more important. And so understanding how this relationship between language and the media looked in the past might give us some insights into what is going on today. In this penultimate slide, I want to think about how to use newspapers and periodicals in historical linguistics. So the first question is how we access them. So there's no way to, or you can't possibly overemphasize the importance of seeing original copies in libraries and archives. But of course, the last few years have underscored the fact that that is not always easy. And unlike when I started this project, digitized versions of some of the newspapers and periodicals are increasingly becoming available. So I've given just one link here to a site run by Stefan Hafmeyer, and here you have transcriptions of just a couple of years of the Gazette de France. So I suspect that this trend is going to continue and that it's going to facilitate research in this area and that it's going to inspire more research in the coming years. But even as these digitized versions come online and we start to be able to carry out much larger scale inquiries than the one that I've done here, I'd really like to underscore for historical linguistics one of the main theses of my book, and that's that it's only by understanding a genre, its features, its functions, its origins and evolution, and its place within the wider system of genres, that as historical linguists, we're going to know what questions to ask. We're going to know how to ask those questions, and we're going to know how to interpret the data. So I wanted to give you just one example of this from the study. So I was looking to try and get a kind of average date of the stage of the language represented by historical texts, by historical newspapers and periodicals. And I did this by looking at a series of forms that we know to have fallen out of usage in the very first part of the 17th century. And for the most part, I basically didn't find very many hits in the corpus for any of the forms. But very surprisingly, for one form, séant, which is used and falls out of usage in literary texts and at the very start of the 17th century, I found 5 examples in 1732. So this might originally sort of make you think, well, maybe something else is going on here. It's not as journalistic language isn't as sort of innovative as we might have thought. But knowing the corpus and looking at the examples in context, let me see that something quite different was happening. So all 5 examples are found in news dispatches that relate to a single political event. This is the so-called lit de justice, when the French king held court from his bed. And the language of these dispatches is incredibly marked by archaism. So you can see that here in this example 1, where you not only have séant, but you have icelle, another form that dropped out in the early 17th century. So rather than pointing to the archaism of journalistic writing in general, this just highlights the very marked nature of texts dealing with the king in the Ancien Régime. And in fact, texts about the king in general seem to be cases where I find quite exceptional usage. I also wanted to speak a little bit to the choice of language, period, and publication. So if you want to work on historical newspapers and periodicals, it would be banal to say that you need to choose a language and a period for which they exist. But I also think that would be incorrect. I think we should be trying to work on this kind of thing for languages and periods where there aren't historical newspapers and periodicals. How do we do that? I think we do that by expanding the breadth of the labels that we use so that we incorporate news in all of its forms, information, and even gossip. This is illustrated just by the French case. So news printed news circulated before the advent of the periodical press in 1631. And indeed, manuscript news continued to circulate in the 17th and 18th centuries, and actually circulated very well because it could escape the system of censorship. As regards the choice of publication, I think there we need to be guided by existing scholarship. So the fact that there hadn't been a large-scale study of the language of the French press led me to choose those publications which historians had determined to be the core generalist publications that reached the largest audience and that were somehow recognized as really important in that field. But now that this has been done, I think it's really kind of urgent on the one hand and exciting on the other to go in new directions and to look at regional publications and to look at specialist publications. I'm really interested to look, for example, at the Journal des Dames. And also, as Susan said right at the start, I'm working on the first periodical devoted to the French language itself, which is founded in 1784, so right at the end of the period that this current book was dealing with. So finally, in this slide then, what can be said about genre as a solution to the bad data problem? So as the quote in one shows, I'm not the first person to think that genre might help us solve this problem. In their introduction to the Manual of Romance Sociolinguistics, Wendy Aris-Bennett and Janice Carruthers note that historical sociolinguists have been doing this by expanding the range of text types and sources that we use to examine language variation and change. Some of the most successful methods that they use, I think, have involved prioritizing handwritten rather than printed sources, diversifying the range of speakers that are represented, looking at ego documents such as diaries and letters, and in general, prioritizing texts that display communicative proximity rather than communicative distance. The texts that I've been working on here show few, if any, of these features, but I hope the last, 50 minutes and 28 seconds have nevertheless convinced you that they are still a valuable source of linguistic data. So the texts that I'm working on may not give us much direct access or even good indirect access to naturalistic speech production in the past. You're not going to find many informal tokens, for example. But through triangulation with other text types, I think we might be able to get there. And we saw this with both the passive and clitic climbing today. By triangulating, we may indirectly be able to access how linguistic change took place and when it took place. So in order to maximize the diversification of genres and text types in historical linguistic research, I think that what we need to do now is really focus on gaining a very solid understanding of the workings of the specific genres and text types that we're incorporating, as well as the workings of any internal factors such as text type, register, domain, or style. And then with that in place, I think we're going to know how most profitably to use data from new text types in order to improve our understanding of the history of individual genres, of the history of individual languages, and of language variation and change. Thank you very much.